Maury Travis was born on October 25, 1965, and was known by the nickname Toby. He lived with his mother Sandra Travis and his father Michael V. Travis in Carr Square, a public housing complex in St. Louis, Missouri. In April 1976, they bought a house at 1001 Ford Avenue in Ferguson. Maury's childhood appeared relatively ordinary. He was introverted and reserved, but known for his exceptional politeness and respect. Adults who interacted with him viewed him as someone very mindful of etiquette and social norms. One teacher noted him as an unusually quiet teenager who even mowed his neighbor's lawn. His demeanor at school was unremarkable, and those who knew him, including teachers, parents, and peers, never suspected him of being capable of violence. When police later interviewed people who attended school with Maury or lived nearby, many didn't even recognize him. He didn't leave a memorable impression. In all of his childhood that is known to us, the separation of his parents was the only potential trauma that he may have experienced. He graduated from McClure High School in 1985 and served 2 years as an Army reservist. Following that, he worked as a medical and dental assistant. Additionally, he managed to secure employment locally with college companies and even volunteered at a local nursing home. Maury Travis's enrollment in Morris Brown College in 1986 at the age of 22 seemed like a positive step forward. However, it was also in this private institute in Atlanta where he encountered and formed a relationship with cocaine, sending his life into a downward spiral. His addiction quickly escalated to a severe level, costing him $300 a day. Maury's plunge into criminal activities to support his habit swiftly brought him to the attention of law enforcement the following year. Up until that point, he had a clean record, making his sudden shift into illegal behavior quite unexpected. Rather than a gradual escalation, his actions took a surprising and abrupt turn from his prior conduct. Maury engaged in a string of robberies that raised eyebrows. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to our new channel, where we uncover captivating and chilling cold cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. You won't want to miss the twists and turns we have in store. To everyone's surprise, he targeted 5 shoe stores in St. Louis within 8 days. What added an unusual twist to these crimes was his choice of weapon. Instead of a loaded firearm, he used a plastic toy gun to instill fear. This abrupt shift into criminal behavior was truly unexpected, especially given his clean record prior to these incidents. This is where Maury Travis took a sharp turn into criminal activity. The armed robberies he committed resulted in his initial capture. Witnesses provided the police with details about his car, leading to his arrest. The detective handling the case was taken aback, as Maury didn't fit the typical image of a criminal. Upon being apprehended, Maury claimed to have hazy memories of the crimes, attributing it to drug influence. While awaiting sentencing, he underwent a drug rehabilitation program and claimed to have successfully overcome his addiction. Despite these efforts and his clean record before this, the court had taken his actions into account during proceedings. Character references poured in support of Maury, including one from a congressman and U.S. representative. These testimonials highlighted his rehabilitation efforts, asserting that his criminal behavior was an aberration in his character. Despite this acknowledgement, Maury received a 15-year prison sentence on July 5, 1989, at the age of 23. This marked the start of his time behind bars for his criminal actions. From the outset, Maury realized that his time in prison wouldn't be easy. He attested to the inhospitable conditions, citing frequent assaults and an abundance of drugs that posed a significant threat to his rehabilitation. Having successfully addressed his dependency issues, he found himself surrounded by drugs in this challenging environment. In a desperate plea to the judge, Maury wrote a letter, urging him to reconsider his sentence, pouring his heart out in the hope of a more lenient outcome. In his plea to the judge, Maury wrote on how he was constantly thinking of taking his own life, due to the horrible conditions he is living in. He ended by asking the judge to give him another chance in society. Maury was granted parole in 1994, serving only 5 years and 3 months of his sentence at the Farmington Correctional Center. His early release was primarily attributed to his exemplary behavior. Although he had 13 conduct violations, they were minor infractions. He moved into a duplex where neighbors regarded him as an excellent resident who didn't cause any disturbances. After serving time initially from March 1989 through June 1994, Maury faced additional prison stays due to drug-related charges from February 1998 to January 1999 due to repeatedly violating his parole. Once outside prison, he worked in various restaurants, keeping to himself mostly. He also displayed an unusual fixation for his 2000 black Mitsubishi Eclipse, spending considerable time cleaning and maintaining it. Although neighbors and classmates of Maury didn't have any suspicious information about him, one of his former girlfriends had something different to say. In March of 2001, Maury's girlfriend left him, and this was when bodies of women began to turn up around town. Maury would actively pick up sex workers along the extended stretch of Broadway, known as the Stroll north of St. Louis. In fact, suspected victims of Maury were later discovered in this area. It gained notoriety for its numerous crack houses and the availability of such workers. Maury would pick them up and then bring them back to his home in Ferguson. Once there, he would keep some of these women for days, subjecting them to his whims. However, it wasn't solely for his personal satisfaction. He recorded the horrifying events taking place in the basement. Videotapes documenting these acts were later discovered, concealed within a wall. Some of the video clips showed Maury engaging in consensual but rough roleplay, involving bondage with women. There were also instances when he was seen using drugs, yet he would let them go unharmed. However, in other footage, Maury could be seen indulging in much darker activities, from keeping women hostage for days in his dungeon to strangling them to death. Law enforcement initially struggled to comprehend why he chose to spare certain women while murdering others. One hypothesis suggests that the tipping point might have been when he discovered that a particular sex worker had children. It appeared that this discovery triggered a violent rage in him, since they chose drugs over their children. Although it's not confirmed, that's the association they've drawn. He also made them perform the most unbelievable rituals. More, he would get them to dance in white clothes. Then at times he'd get them to wear sunglasses where the lenses were completely blacked out so they couldn't see. By doing this, he was taking power away from them completely. He would then restrain their legs with a rope and handcuff them. At times, he'd even cover their eyes with duct tape. They saw these women shackled to a wooden post with Maury verbally taunting them. He would tell them what was going to happen, or they needed to berate them as well. At times, he'd get angry because he'd find out that these women had children. He also used to criticize them, expressing aggression and violence due to their choice of drugs over their kids. In some of the earliest footage, Maury is actually seen standing over a kneeling naked woman heavily bound with a rope and handcuff. Then he suddenly grabs the belt, snaps it tightly around her neck, and strangles her until she's unconscious and she's limp. He may even have broken her neck. He then just leaves her body face down on the floor. It's truly horrifying to think that Maury Travis was able to carry out such horrific crimes without raising suspicion. One thing we know is Maury Travis' ability to blend into the background made him a master of disguise. His unassuming nature allowed him to operate unnoticed, making him the last person anyone would suspect of such heinous crimes. On July 31, 2000, the discovery of the first known victim, Mary Shields, 61, in East St. Louis, Illinois, began a haunting pattern. In the months that followed, the tragedies escalated. On March 24, 2001, the body of Cassandra F. Walker, 19, was found in Washington Park, Alyssa Greenway. A 34-year-old caught in a seemingly hopeless cycle of addiction was discovered deceased on April 1, 2001, in Washington Park, Illinois. Her body showed signs of strangulation, with ligature marks found on her wrists and ankles. Near her body, authorities found a tire impression, identified as a Bridgestone Potenza tire, which was photographed for further analysis. Not long after, on May 15, 2001, Teresa Wilson, 36, was discovered in West Alton, Missouri. May 30, 2001, marked the discovery of Betty James, 46, in St. Louis, with an evident tire impression distinct from earlier scenes. The St. Louis Police Department strongly believed that all these murders were the work of the same individual, as the crimes were executed in a similar manner. By June 29, 2001, Verona Thompson, 36, was found in West Alton, Missouri. Following this, on August 25, 2001, Yvonne Cruz, 50, was discovered in East St. Louis, Illinois. The haunting silence after October 8, 2001, when Brenda Beasley, age 33, was found dead in East St. Louis, Illinois, raised speculation. Authorities speculated three possible scenarios. Either the perpetrator was in custody, had passed away, or had relocated from the area. However, the unsettling quiet broke as the year changed. The cycle resumed, claiming for more lives. The first unidentified victim was found on January 30, 2002. Another unidentified victim was found near Muscatoa, Illinois, on March 11, 2002. The next unidentified victim was discovered in Columbia, Illinois, on March 28, 2002. And the final unidentified victim was reported in West Alton, Missouri, on May 25, 2002. Each day marked a sorrowful moment, revealing a frightening pattern. What ultimately led to uncovering the killer will stun you like never before. In an attempt to bring attention to one of the victims and maintain public interest in the investigation, Bill Smith penned an article. This was about Teresa Wilson, a victim, and her life struggles leading up to her unfortunate demise. She named the killer the Streetwalker Strangler. The article was published in the paper's May 19, 2002 issue. Less than a week later, Smith received a letter at his desk. While it's not uncommon for media personnel to receive letters or correspondence, this letter had an unusual return address on the envelope. I thralled him. 325 to 331 Lafayette Street, New York, New York, 10012. The letter bore a St. Louis postmark, indicating it had been mailed locally. The zip code 10012 encompasses portions of Manhattan's Soho, NoHo, Nolita, and Greenwich Village neighborhoods. The letter bore a St. Louis postmark, indicating it had been mailed locally. However, the thraldom address is fictional. So why would someone use that term for an address? According to Merriam-Webster, thraldom refers to the state of being an enslaved person. It also served as the name of a bondage website. Using what appeared to be Lucida handwriting font in red ink with minimal punctuation, Smith initially believed it was a prank. He quickly realized the letter was no joke and that a person claiming to be the Streetwalker Strangler was contacting him. The letter read, "Dear Bill, nice sob story about Teresa Wilson. Write one about Greenway. Write a good one, and I'll tell you where many others are to prove I'm real. Here's directions to number 17. Search in a 50-yard radius from the X. Put the story in the Sunday paper like the last." The letter Bill received included a map of West Alton marked with an X, indicating the location of a body. This sender offered to reveal the locations of additional victims and, as evidence of their identity, provided directions to number 17, accompanied by a typed internet-generated map. After finding a skeleton at the marked spot, authorities focused on the map, which appeared to have been generated using an internet mapping service. They found a possible match on Expedia.com, according to an affidavit by FBI agent Melanie Jimenez. On May 30, 2002, Expedia informed Jimenez that Microsoft, based in Redmond, Washington, provided the data for its map site. The FBI requested records of any maps of West Alton made between May 18, 2002, the date of the newspaper story that prompted the letter, and May 21, 2002, the postmark on the envelope. It took 4 days to receive a response. On June 3, 2002, Microsoft reported that only one computer had accessed the map during the specified time period. The company further revealed that on May 20, 2002, that the computer had zoomed in on the map of the West Alton, Missouri area, approximately 10 times in chronological order, eventually generating a map that matched the one sent to the Post-Dispatch. However, Microsoft could not provide a name, only an IP address. A meaningless string of numbers to most people, 65.227.106.78. To translate the IP number into a name, the FBI turned to WorldCom Incorporated, which provided local telephone numbers to connect internet services to their dial-up customers. WorldCom assigns a temporary IP address to each customer for each internet session. The challenge was not just to identify who used 65.227.106.78, but also to determine who used it at the specific time in question. WorldCom's Internet Division, UUNet, identified the user as MSN/Maury Travis. This led to the identification of the user's real name, Maury Troy Travis of Ferguson. Before this, back in 2001, Maury also hinted about his crime to one of his co-workers. He told him that East St. Louis was a good place to hide objects, due to minimal police presence. He also told his co-worker's girlfriend, who worked at a TV station, that prostitutes' bodies were dumped in the same area. Maury didn't state that he was the one who killed them, but he said he knew about it from a friend. The taunting letter to the editor and his hints to co-workers suggest that Maury might have been one of those serial killers who craved attention. His actions indicate a desire to be found, a twisted sense of power derived from the fear he instilled in the community. This information provided the basis for surveillance, and on June 7, 2002, an arrest and search warrant. The warrant led to the discovery of evidence, including DNA and tire tread marks, linking Maury, a 36-year-old waiter, to some of the killings. Investigators launched a thorough search of Maury's residence in Ferguson, Missouri, uncovering a horrifying scene. Hidden within the depths of his home, they discovered a torture chamber. The ground floor of his home was tidy and well-maintained. The woman who lived with him, identified as his girlfriend, told police she had no clue about the basement and had never been there. While police officers examined the house and basement, FBI agents and other investigators conducted a 2-hour interrogation of Maury in his living room. They learned that his mother owned the residence and had allowed him to stay there. Authorities later revealed that Maury evaded giving direct answers, and instead inquired about how they had located him. Upon being informed that the computer-printed map had led them to his doorstep, Maury became enraged. Shortly after police escorted Maury outside and placed him in a car, he consented to accompanying the police downtown for further questioning. Computer forensics experts entered the house to inspect Maury's computer, where they uncovered drafts of the letter sent to journalist Bill Smith. Investigators uncovered a house of horrors. They found blood stains on the walls and on the ceiling and on the carpet and furniture as well. Within this, they discovered chilling torture instruments, a menacing stun gun, and newspaper clippings documenting his heinous crimes. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. Videotapes capturing Maury's unspeakable acts of violence, subjecting his victims to horrific acts. The evidence from this torture chamber, coupled with DNA analysis, suggested that he committed the murders of between 12 and 20 women. He had been preying on vulnerable individuals, many of whom were drug addicts and sex workers, in the states of Missouri and Illinois between 2000 and 2022. Travis asked for a soda during questioning. Later, the can he drank from was sent to the lab for testing. DNA swabs were taken from the area near the opening of the can for epithelial cells in Travis' saliva, which could be used for DNA testing. Travis' DNA profile was then compared to the biological material found on 2 of the murder victims, Yvonne Cruz and Brenda Beasley. St. Louis Police Captain Harry Heeger said that the investigators also found a crude diagram in Maury's home, showing plans for a basement extension. Heeger said that Maury was planning to build 2 cells in the basement, where he could, and then he was planning to build vents connecting the basement to the outside. Heeger said that Maury also made a list of things that he needed to keep the woman captive for some time, and that one of the items on the list was adult diapers. We spoke about the victims who were identified, but now let us uncover a few who are not known till the present. On May 25, 2002, the tragic case of St. Charles County Jane Doe came to light, adding another victim to the list of serial killer Maury Troy Travis. The woman's remains were discovered near West Alton, Missouri, leaving her identity shrouded in mystery for 21 years. The discovery of St. Charles County Jane Doe unfolded following the anonymous letter sent to local reporter Bill Smith on May 21, 2002. The skeletal remains of St. Charles County Jane Doe were found west of Highway 67 and scattered over a 30-foot wide area. It was determined that she was a female, between the ages of 25 and 35, of black ethnicity and approximately 5 feet 4 inches in height. 1 or more limbs and 1 or both hands were not recovered. The remains found at the crime scene included a sleeveless coarse blouse denim dress with metal buttons, a black and silver V-neck stretch, a torn piece of blue jean-type material, a white cotton tube sock, a blue shoestring-type tie-up in the back, and a thin white cotton fragment. A few months prior, on March 28, 2002, another discovery had been made, the remains of an unidentified woman. She would come to be known as Monroe County Jane Doe, one of the 3 victims of the notorious St. Louis serial killer, Maury Travis. Her identity remains a mystery, her story shrouded in silence. She was believed to be between the ages of 29 and 50, her African-American heritage evident in her skin tone. She stood at 5 feet 1 inch tall. Her petite frame weighed about 105 pounds. Her dark brown hair bore the mark of a healed fracture on her forehead, possibly a mark of a childhood injury. There was no indication that she had ever given birth. At the time of her discovery, they could find only skeletal remains, along with a green shirt and the letter M and the word Mavericks in orange lettering. Her attire was completed by khaki canvas shorts and a brown leather belt with a silver buckle. These simple garments provided the only clues to her identity, silent witnesses to her life. Just a few weeks before that, on March 11, 2002, in Marine, Illinois, the remains of Madison County Jane Doe were found. Madison County Jane Doe was believed to be between the ages of 23 and 30. Her ethnicity identified as Black. Her height was estimated to be between 5 feet 1 inch and 5 feet 6 inches, and she weighed around 105 pounds. She also had dark hair. When discovered, the victim's decomposed body was clad in a red and white checkered flannel-style shirt, bearing the brand Tommy Hilfiger and the pair of gray shorts from the brand's Second Skins. A little under 2 months before that, St. Clair County Jane Doe, a woman whose identity remains a mystery, was discovered on January 30, 2002. Her skeletal remains were found in Mascot, Illinois, though the exact cause of her death remains undetermined. She is presumed to be one of the unidentified victims of serial killer Maury Troy Travis. At the time of her discovery, she was believed to be between the ages of 20 and 40, of African-American descent. Her skeletal remains revealed clues about her life, including 3 piercings in her right ear, a healed fracture above her left ankle, and additional healed fractures on her nasal bones, left second rib, wrist, and below her neck. She was found wearing a black velour sleeveless catsuit, bearing the brand Jason Matthews, with full-length legs. 2 yellow metal rings adorned her left middle finger. People were shocked and confused by how a man with such an appealing personality could be involved in these terrible crimes. The mother of one of his ex-girlfriends from Pagedale expressed her shock and disbelief over the news of Maury's arrest. Her daughter had dated him back in 2001, and she described him as a perfect gentleman who always seemed happy and laid back. She couldn't believe that the man she knew could be different from the person now accused of such heinous crimes. Maury was suspected of being involved in and he was also charged with 2 counts of kidnapping. Federal court documents linked him to these crimes. Police investigators believed that Maury may have killed more than 17 women in total. Following his arrest on June 7, 2002, Maury was taken into custody for interrogation and was placed on preventative monitoring until his trial for the alleged offenses. Just when St. Louis thought justice had been served with Maury's arrest on June 7, 2002, the city saw darkness again. 3 days later, on June 10, 2002, Maury planned to escape his sentence. He did that in the most unthinkable way possible. Maury Travis reportedly wrote a brief note on a sheet of paper in his 8th-floor jail cell in Clayton. Outside the cell, another inmate tasked with monitoring Maury attempted to keep watch through a window. Maury had no desire to spend the rest of his life in prison or face execution by injection. He conveyed to those who would read his final words. Instead, he decided to end his life on his own terms. He explained that he left a note to demonstrate, "You guys didn't kill me." His note read, "Dear Mom, I'm sorry for the pain this caused you and the family. My death seems to be the only way out and a fast end to all the publicity. You were the best mother a man could have. But I've been sick for a long time, sick in the head, since I was about 14. I don't know why, I was just sick. I've never felt normal or happy at any time in my life. I think about the life I lead and what's ahead of me. This seems the best solution for all involved, especially me, because I won't spend the rest of my life locked up, or worse, let them kill me with a needle. Tell Grandma, Marina, James, and everybody, I love them dearly. I love you the most, but you know that. Forever your son, Toby Travis. Jail regulations prohibited the inmate assigned to the anti-self-harm vigil from maintaining a clear view of what was to transpire, and the guards, violating jail rules, skipped 2 15-minute checks, providing Maury with 45 minutes of privacy to carry out his plan. According to Clayton police, Maury meticulously threaded a torn strip of bedsheet through small holes in a jail wall vent 6 feet from the floor, and looped the other end around his neck. He placed a pillowcase over his head, stuffed additional cloth into his mouth, and somehow managed to tie his hands behind his back. 12 years after Maury himself died in prison, his mother, Sandra Travis, still owned the home where he committed his horrific acts in 2014. She rented the home to Katrina McGaw without mentioning the house's dark past. McGaw learned about the house's history from a television documentary and requested to break her lease, but Sandra refused. News 4 contacted Sandra, who claimed she had informed McGaw about the house's past. McGaw denied this, stating she would have remembered the murders if Sandra had told her. Technically, landlords are not obligated to disclose information about a home's past. In this country, landlords are only required to report physical defects. The St. Louis Housing Authority intervened, allowing McGaw to move out at the end of the month. Despite Sandra's objections, this situation was complex. On one hand, it was understandable that Sandra, the mother of a serial killer, would want to put the past behind her. She was legally entitled to rent the house without disclosing any information about past events, but it may not be ethically right to do so. On the other hand, Maga, who had a 2-year-old daughter, was uncomfortable living in a house where women were tortured and murdered. She also mentioned that her daughter had been occasionally playing near the same pool in the basement where Maury Travis tied up his victims. Considering how disturbing the whole situation was, McGaw understandably wanted to move out as soon as possible. Sadly, the victims found no closure. Moreover, several victims remain unidentified, adding to the heartbreak of this case. After witnessing these tragic events, one thing becomes evident. You never truly know who lives next door. This monstrous individual was carrying out these heinous acts right beneath everyone's noses, escaping notice even from those close to him. What's truly confounding is the mystery surrounding his actions. How could he commit 17 murders in his basement without anyone suspecting a thing? Not even the woman he dated? And then the ultimate enigma. Why did he choose to end his own life in that prison cell? Was the prison reality more horrific than the agony these women faced? Or was he such a narcissist that he couldn't bear anyone else deciding when his life would end? Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. Early on September 16, 1973, an elderly man took his dog for a Sunday morning walk near Landersea, a village in South Wales recognized as the site of the UK's first oil refinery. While walking through a small wooded area, he initially thought he had found a mannequin. As he approached, he realized he was mistaken. He had actually come upon the lifeless body of a young woman. Police were notified and soon discovered another young woman's body about 50 yards away from the first. Both teenagers were found with a long length of rope wrapped around their neck. It would later be confirmed that they had been strangled to death with the rope. It would also be determined that they had both been raped. They had been allowed to redress before being killed. The second young woman found also had a serious head injury. It appeared she had briefly escaped her attacker and ran a short distance before he caught her and hit her over the head. Based on where her body was found, it appeared she had nearly made it to a busy nearby road before she was caught. 2 local families had been out looking for their teenage daughters who had failed to come home after going out together to a club the night before. When they saw the large police presence at the crime scene, they approached a police officer and asked for assistance. Family members were asked to view the 2 bodies to determine if they could identify them. The families confirmed that the bodies were those of Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd. Both Geraldine and Pauline came from working-class and family-oriented backgrounds. Geraldine grew up as somewhat of a tomboy in part because she and her cousin Julie were the only two girls in their extended family. She was just as tough as her male cousins and able to keep up with all of their roughhousing. Geraldine had a fun and bubbly personality. Pauline was not as outgoing as Geraldine, but the two were still best friends. In 1973, they were both 16 years old. Both girls had recently finished school and worked together in a local clothing factory. They paid a portion of their income to their parents because they still lived at home, but what little disposable income they had went to their Saturday nights out and the clothes and makeup they wore to the nightclubs. On the evening of September 15, 1973, Pauline and Geraldine were out together at the Top Rank nightclub in Swansea. Geraldine's cousin Phil saw Geraldine and Pauline as they were leaving the nightclub as it was closing down. They were happy and having a good time. He told Geraldine to get home safely before they parted ways. He would never see his cousin alive again. Pauline and Geraldine had arrived in Swansea by bus. However, buses were not running at 1 a.m. when the club shut down for the night and there were few taxis available. Even if Geraldine and Pauline could have found a taxi, it would have cost them at least £4 to get home, an unreasonable expense considering they each only made £16 a week working at the factory. They decided to hitchhike, as was common practice for young people in the area at the time. Pauline and Geraldine lived in the neighboring villages of Landersea and Skewen, respectively. On this night, they were traveling approximately 7 miles to Landersea as Geraldine was meant to spend the night at Pauline's family home. The last witness to see the girls alive was a passing motorist who reported seeing them getting into a white car. A man named Philip O'Connor saw the girls standing near a bus stop down the road from the nightclub they had visited that night. He then saw a white car pull over and let them in. While Philip was waiting at the next traffic light, the white car pulled up next to him. He glanced over to see Pauline and Geraldine, both sitting in the front seat of the car talking and laughing with the driver. The driver was a man in his early 30s with a mustache and bushy hair, but Philip did not get a very good look at his face. The road along the wooded area where Geraldine and Pauline's bodies were found was a busy one, even in the middle of the night. Drivers reported seeing a white car, identified as an Austin 1100, parked near the entrance to the wooded area between 1:45 and 2:15 a.m. the night of the murders. Unfortunately, no one saw the car's registration number. Such a vehicle had also been seen near another crime scene in the area 2 months earlier. That crime had numerous other similarities to the murders of Geraldine and Pauline. Sandra Newton was beautiful with long dark hair. She had a reserved personality but a sweet laugh. Like Geraldine and Pauline, she was 16 years old in 1973. Also like Geraldine and Pauline, she was last seen while out on a Saturday night in South Wales. Sandra was out in the village of Britton Ferry on the night of July 14, 1973. She went to the Traveller's Rest pub and, later, the Baron nightclub. She left the club at 1 a.m. with her boyfriend. The couple found an abandoned van on a side street and had sex. They parted ways on the street near the local working man's club, and Sandra began the 5-mile walk back home. However, it is believed she may have tried to hitchhike to get a ride like many young people routinely did. Sandra's body was found 2 days later at the entrance of a culvert near an abandoned coal mine in the village of Tonmower. No effort had been made to conceal her body, and police believed her killer must have been a local in order to be familiar with the remote area. Sandra had been beaten about the head and strangled with the hem of her skirt. Police initially reported that she had not been raped, assuming all the evidence of sexual activity found during her autopsy was the result of the consensual sex she had shortly before her death. It would be decades before forensic science showed that this assumption was incorrect. While there were similarities between Sandra's murder and the murders of Pauline and Geraldine, there was some debate amongst investigators over whether or not the same man killed all 3 girls. There were some investigators who suspected Sandra's boyfriend was responsible for her murder both because he was the last person to see her and because he was a married man. However, he did not have a driver's license or a car, raising the question of how Sandra's body ended up several miles away from Britton Ferry if he had been her killer. Regardless of whether or not all three girls had been killed by the same man, their murders sent the surrounding communities into a panic. Police officers were everywhere, parents wouldn't let their teenage daughters out of their sight, and posters were displayed discouraging young people from hitchhiking. Everyone feared the killer could be someone they knew and looked on their neighbors with suspicion. The killer was called the Saturday Night Strangler in the press. Over the years, the murders have also been called the Clandars murders because of where Geraldine and Pauline's bodies were found, or the Port Talbot or Steeltown murders because of their proximity to the city of Port Talbot and the massive steelworks located there. The steelworks employed 13,000 men who lived throughout the surrounding area, so it was conceivable that the killer was connected to it. However, while the community was concerned that the killer was one of their own, a large number of men from across the UK and around the world had reason to be in the area at the time. The annual Neath Fair was on, attracting large crowds and bringing people in from outside the immediate area. Saturday, September 15th, had been the fair's biggest night, and Geraldine and Pauline had actually attended it before going home to get ready for their final Saturday night out. In addition, the M4 motorway was being constructed at the time, with laborers traveling into the area looking for work on the project. Some of them were not residents of the UK and had to be tracked down in other countries if police wanted to speak with them, but did not do so before their work on the motorway was over and they returned home. The Saturday Night Strangler was believed to be the first serial killer in Wales, and the hunt for him was the largest police investigation in Welsh history. More than 150 detectives were brought in to work the case. More than 35,000 people throughout the region were spoken to. 11,000 of them were the owners of white or light-colored vehicles. Even though witnesses identified the suspect vehicle as an Austin 1100 specifically, this was a very common car at the time. Examining all such vehicles and speaking to their owners, even in a relatively small region, was a laborious and time-consuming process. Without computers, police relied on a system of index cards filed and cross-referenced in 100 of boxes to organize the information from these efforts. Despite the enormity of the investigation, by the spring of 1974, less than a year after Sandra, Pauline, and Geraldine were killed, police were out of leads and the investigation wound down. On the third anniversary of Geraldine and Pauline's murders, Geraldine's mother, Jean, led a protest outside of 10 Downing Street, the official residence and offices of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. 50 of her co-workers from the clothing factory where Geraldine had also worked carried handmade signs with sayings like "Bring back hanging." She brought with her to London a petition she had organized, which received more than 9,000 signatures. She told the press, "I can't accept what happened to Geraldine. It has left me very bitter. If they ever catch the person responsible, they should hang him. I want him to feel a rope around his neck like the girls felt." The case was revisited periodically as a matter of formality over the following decades, but little progress was made. When DNA analysis came into use by law enforcement, there was little hope it would help solve this case, even though the girls' underwear was preserved as evidence. In the early days of DNA analysis, quite a large sample was required for testing, which was not available in the Saturday Night Strangler investigation. However, by the late 1990s, technology advanced to the point where even a minute sample could be tested for DNA. The Saturday Night Strangler might be identified by his DNA after all. After 2 years of work, only a partial DNA profile of the killer could be extracted from the evidence preserved from Geraldine, but a full DNA profile was developed from Pauline's evidence. However, there was no match to the profile amongst the 1,700,000 DNA profiles in the UK's Criminal National DNA Database, so police would have to identify suspects and then take samples of their DNA for testing. In January of 2000, the investigation was formally reopened in hopes of using this DNA profile to finally identify the killer. The renewed effort was named Operation Magnum. The murders had occurred nearly 27 years earlier, and at the time, no crime in the United Kingdom had ever been solved after such a long time had passed. Operation Magnum had only been given enough funding to test 500 DNA samples. Given the fact that the original case files contained tens of thousands of names of potential suspects based on their location, criminal history, or ownership of an Austin 1100, narrowing down the suspect pool to the 500 most likely suspects was a massive undertaking. Rupert Heritage, former chief of the Behavioral Science Unit of Surrey Police, created a 14-point criminal profile to help identify the killer, which stated that the Saturday Night Strangler would have a history of minor property crimes, live in the region where the murders occurred, and would have started his criminal career at an early age. Because so much time had passed and many men from outside the area had been there at the time of the murders, investigators had to go as far away as New Zealand to get DNA samples from the men they ultimately placed on their relatively short list of suspects. All 353 men asked to provide a DNA sample did so willingly, although some took more convincing than others. None of these samples matched the crime scene DNA. A major breakthrough in the case occurred in October of 2001 when Dr. Jonathan Whitaker, a DNA specialist, managed to identify an unknown male DNA profile from swabs taken from Sandra Newton's body. Initial testing of the swabs from her body had revealed a mix of DNA from 3 people: Sandra, her boyfriend, and another individual. Dr. Whitaker was finally able to isolate the third profile and found it to be a match to the DNA from the other murder scene. While it had long been suspected that Sandra had been killed by the same man who killed Pauline and Geraldine, this evidence finally confirmed that the same man killed all 3 girls. This news was beneficial for police because it confirmed that there had been a serial killer in South Wales in 1973 and that they were looking for only one man for all 3 murders. However, for Sandra's loved ones, the news had varying effects. Sandra's boyfriend at the time of her death had spent nearly 30 years facing suspicion over and harassment for his perceived potential involvement in Sandra's murder from members of his community. When police told him that the DNA evidence had proven his innocence, he became emotional and told them he could now finally walk down the street with his head held high. For Sandra's mother, Pat, however, the news was devastating. Again, police had initially believed that Sandra had not been sexually assaulted because they knew she had consensual sex shortly before her death and therefore viewed all the evidence of sexual activity found at her autopsy as the result of her earlier encounter with her boyfriend. However, the presence of semen from the same man who had raped and murdered Pauline and Geraldine on her body proved that Sandra had been raped by her killer. Pat had said ever since Sandra was murdered that the only consolation she had was that her daughter had not been raped before she was killed. Police now had to take away the one small comfort she had in coping with the nightmare that was her daughter's murder. The same month, Dr. Whitaker proposed a novel approach to using the DNA profile to identify the killer. The killer's DNA was not in the criminal database, but what if he had children? Enough time had passed since the murders that even if the killer did not have children until after he killed all 3 girls, his children would now be adults and subject to having their DNA entered into the database should they commit a serious enough crime. Searching for an exact match in the criminal database had not revealed the killer, but what if they looked for partial matches? Dr. Whitaker did ultimately find a DNA profile in the database that could have been from the son of the killer. It belonged to Paul Capin, a local car thief. Capin was a name known to investigators. Joseph Capin, Paul Capin's father, had been suspect number 200 on their list of the 500 most probable suspects based on information from the original investigation. However, when they had tried to collect a sample of his DNA, they had learned that he was dead. Capin was a native of Port Talbot and lived in the sand fields that stayed there at the time of the murders. He was sometimes employed as a bouncer or a bus driver and was in and out of jail. His criminal career began when he was just 12 years old and he racked up more than 30 documented minor offenses, ranging from stealing from gas meters to burglary to assault. Capin was a violent man who severely abused and terrorized his wife and 2 children. He also was known to pursue young girls, using his various jobs as a bouncer to meet and try to get close to them. Capin had been interviewed on October 13, 1973 because he owned a white Austin 1100 and his name had been given to investigators by a police officer who routinely had to deal with him. Capin told police he had gotten home from the Neath Fair around 9:30 on the night of Pauline and Geraldine's murders and had been home with his wife the rest of the night. She corroborated his story, as she had long since been conditioned to do whenever police came asking questions to avoid violence from her husband. Capin's white Austin had been up on blocks in the yard with the wheels removed when police came for the interview. He told them that the car had been there since the day after the murders. This was a lie. In the week after the murders, police were stopping any and all white Austin 1100s in the area to question their drivers. Capan had been stopped while driving the vehicle during this effort, meaning the car was still in use long after he said it was out of operation. The lie was not noticed until DNA made Capan the prime suspect in 2001. Police hypothesized that he took the wheels off the car after it was reported in newspapers that police had found tire tracks at the crime scene. Capan and his wife had eventually divorced. His ex-wife and daughter cooperated with police and provided samples of their DNA. Comparing the DNA of Capan's 2 children and their mother to the crime scene DNA, scientists were able to say that Capan was still a likely suspect. However, they still did not have a direct DNA sample from him. While it appeared that Capan was a Saturday night strangler, investigators wanted to be able to say with certainty that his DNA was a match to that from the crime scenes. On Christmas Eve of 2001, investigators submitted an application to the Home Secretary of the United Kingdom requesting permission to exhume the body of Joseph Capan. They used all of the familial DNA testing as evidence supporting the exhumation. The application was approved and the exhumation was scheduled for May of 2002. Investigators and a forensics team set up a tent over Capan's grave on May 15, 2002, so that they were prepared to begin the exhumation rite at midnight. There had been good weather for most of the day, but as the exhumation grew closer, a storm rolled in. Capan had been buried in a family plot when he died in 1990 at the age of 49, and his coffin was between those of his grandfather and stepfather. Right when the team reached Capan's coffin, a huge clap of thunder sounded. Multiple members of the team reported feeling uneasy, as if something evil was being brought up to the surface. Capan's remains were taken to Morrison Hospital in Swansea for examination. A tooth and one of his femurs were taken into evidence so that scientists could attempt to extract DNA from them before the remains were re-entered. DNA was successfully extracted from the remains and the profile was a match to that from the crime scenes. Nearly 30 years after Sandra Newton, Geraldine Hughes, and Pauline Floyd were murdered, Joseph Capan was identified as their killer and their cases were closed. Familial DNA and the related technique of investigative genetic genealogy developed later in the age of commercial DNA sites have become common investigative techniques. In 2002, such techniques were groundbreaking. The Saturday Night Strangler case is believed to be the first case in which familial DNA was ever used, as well as the first case to be solved by it. Solving this case after so much time had passed was an extraordinary achievement, especially for the time period. However, investigators were somewhat disappointed in the outcome of the case. They had been working in hopes of arresting and prosecuting the killer so that he could be punished for what he had done. Capan had avoided conviction and incarceration. They had found answers in their investigation, but no justice for Sandra, Pauline, and Geraldine. Once Capan's name was made public, multiple women came forward saying they believed he was the man who had assaulted or attempted to abduct them back in the 1960s or 70s. He is the main suspect in 2 rapes that involved ropes and took place in the months before Sanders' murder. However, the evidence in those cases was destroyed, so it cannot be tested for DNA. He is also a suspect in the death of Maureen Mulcahy, a 23-year-old mother of 2 who was found strangled after a night out in a burfin in February of 1976. DNA was not found when the evidence from her case was re-examined in 2002, but there has been a push for investigators to examine it again now that technology has advanced further. Capan developed lung cancer in 1988. Maybe it was karma catching up to him or just the somewhat expected outcome of his pack-a-day smoking habit. He wasted away over the next 2 years and needed a wheelchair in the end. There appear to be no public statements from his family about his actual death. We can only hope that it was painful and that he fought for his final breaths. He never felt the rope of a noose around his neck, as Geraldine's mother had once hoped, but hopefully he felt the fear caused by being unable to breathe that he had inflicted on his victims all those years earlier. Pauline, Geraldine, and Sandra's murderer was not identified for almost 30 years. Despite this, their parents all lived to learn the killer's name. Pauline's father, Trevor, was 89 years old at the time and relieved he was able to live long enough to see the identification made. Geraldine's parents, Denver and Jean, broke down in tears when they learned Capan had been confirmed to be the man who had taken their daughter from them. They went to Geraldine's grave after they received the news. Denver later told the press, We took a few flowers to Geraldine's grave and had a few quiet words with her. We felt we had put her to rest properly at long last. Social butterfly Martha Elizabeth Moxley was known for her extroverted, fun-loving nature. Born to Dorothy and John David Moxley on August 16, 1960, Martha was the youngest in her family with her older brother John. After her father was transferred from his job in Piedmont, California, in 1974, the family moved to a spacious new home in Connecticut. Relocating 3,000 miles away to the affluent suburbs of Belle Haven was a significant change, but Martha was very adaptable. In a short time, she made many friends, and her vivacious personality and self-confidence drew classmates to her. Within just 9 months in town, she was voted the most popular girl at Western Junior High School. Her rapid rise in popularity also made her well known among the boys. Martha was someone who seemed to have everything going for her. She was friendly, athletic, and talented in the arts, with everything coming easily to her. Her brother John recalled in an interview that she was very easy to get along with, upbeat, and friendly, the kind of kid anyone would enjoy being around. Despite her popularity, Martha was also family-oriented. She often spent time at home making sketches or playing with her cat Tiger. Like any other teenager, she had a wilder side too. In the summer of 1975, Martha spent most of her days at the Belle Haven Club, playing tennis or swimming leisurely. She would often socialize around the pool with other children of exclusive clubs. The kids of these clubs were described to be of a different breed, unlike her other friends. They went to private academies and boarding schools and enjoyed a wealth that was daunting, even by Greenwich standards. Amongst these kids, one family especially stood out, and that was the Skakel family, cousins to the infamous Kennedys. Martha was known to share close connections with the Skakel boys, Thomas and Michael. The Skakels were neighbors to the Moxley family. Michael and Thomas Skakel were both nephews of Ethel Skakel and her husband, Robert F. Kennedy. The families related to and Robert happened to be the brother of the late President John F. Kennedy. Ethel Skakel's brother, Rushton, and his wife, and had 7 children. Amongst them were Thomas and Michael Skakel, who were 15-year-old respectively at the time of Martha's murder in 1975. The Skakels were far from a happy family. Michael Skakel would later cite chronic illness, alcoholism, and a repressive Catholic morale and sexual outlook as persistent causes for household turmoil. In 1973, Skakels passed away from brain cancer, leaving her alcoholic husband, Rushton Skakel, to further delve into a worse state. He would often leave the children home alone with insufficient supervision and unlimited funds. Michael Skakel expressed that even a more intense level of chaos came to rule our household as a result of his mother's death. The Moxleys lived just about 150 yards away from them. The Skakels would often have a constant stream of teenagers at their place, thanks to the lack of parental supervision. Martha was experiencing her best summer days within the comfort of the gated community in Belle Haven. Her teenage years were filled with occasional sneaking out, added with smoking and a few beers. In her diary, Martha shared a few instances that happened over the course of these holidays. Many of them were in reference to the Skakel boys, as Martha was especially concerned with the advancements she was receiving from Thomas. On September 12, 1975, she wrote, "Dear Diary, me, Jackie, Michael, Thomas, Hope, Maureen, and Andrea when driving in Tom's car. I was practically sitting on Thomas's lap because I was only steering. He kept putting his hands on my knee. Then I was driving again and Tom put his arm around me. He kept doing stuff like that." Martha also wrote a note about Michael on September 19, 1975, which said, "Michael was so totally out of it that he was being a real asshole in his actions and words. He kept telling me that I was leading Tom on when I don't like him except as a friend. I said, well, how about you and Jackie? You keep telling me that you don't like her and you're all over her. He doesn't understand that he can be nice to her without hanging all over her." It was quite evident that Martha had mixed feelings about the Skakel brothers and often reconsidered if she should stop hanging around their place. The doubt of her own safety and comfort kept looming over her mind, but no one could have expected what was coming next. On October 30th, 1975, mischief hour arrived. Martha did her best to convince her mother to let her out with her friends. John, Martha's dad, was out on a business trip, so she tried every trick in the book to get her mother's approval. After some consistent nagging, Dorothy fell short to her daughter's pleas and gave her permission to go out for the night. Belle Haven was a well-secured community. Everyone coming in and going out was well inspected, and crimes within such a safe locality were highly unlikely. Martha went out with her friends, Jackie, Jeffrey, and Helen. The three of them went over to Skacko's place where they were supposed to meet with Kennedy cousins. The night went on and soon enough midnight struck. Dorothy was used to her daughter occasionally missing her curfew, so her panic didn't settle until 2 a.m. At first, she thought Martha might have just slept over at her friend's place. She called Martha's best friend, Sheila, in search of her whereabouts, only to find out that she hadn't seen her since 9:30 p.m., about the same time when all the kids went back home. After 3:30 a.m. rolled around, Dorothy was worried sick and decided to call their neighbor, Thomas Skakel, who also replied the same thing as Sheila. After 3:35 a.m., she finally gave up and ended up calling the police for help. The local Greenwich officers were sent to the Moxley household almost immediately. After a quick check around the neighborhood with Dorothy, they couldn't find anything out of sorts. The officers ended up giving assurance to Dorothy and asked her to wait till the morning. Although right before the officers headed back, they sent out Martha's information to all the nearby stations to stay alert for any sightings of Martha. Dorothy soon fell asleep beside the window waiting for her daughter to show up. The following morning of October 31st, 1975, Dorothy rushed over to Martha's room only to find her bed empty. The police were called in yet again, and a deep, unsettling feeling had started to creep over her. She knew something wasn't right. Dorothy couldn't just sit back and wait, so she decided to go around the neighborhood with her son, John, and the first place she went to look was the Skakel household. Over the course of 15 months of them living here, Dorothy had never been over to her neighbor's house, and the first thing she was greeted with was their aggressive dog. Pretty shaken up from the frightening encounter, she knocked on the door, and the younger Skakel brother, Michael, opened it soon after. In spite of that, Dorothy was adamant to find something, so she asked to take a look over at the camper parked outside. She assumed that Martha might have just fallen asleep in the back of the camper, but after checking inside, her hopes were crushed as it was empty as well. The word of Martha's disappearance had gone around the locality by this time, and friends and neighbors had come along with the police to inspect the grounds of Belle Haven. Not long after noon, Martha's friend Sheila rushed over to the Moxley household. Shivering in fear, she fumbled to come up with the words to describe what she just witnessed. Through her tears, Sheila pleaded with Martha's mom to call 911 for help. She said something terrible had happened and Martha's not moving. Someone had attacked her and they needed to get help. Dorothy's friend, Jean, who was with her at the time, asked her to stay put as he went back to check on what had happened. As soon as Jean reached the site, he made a gruesome discovery. 200 feet away from her house, lying face down under a large pine tree at the edge of the Moxley property, was the missing teen. The back of her head was bludgeoned and the broken golf club was sticking right out through the back of her neck. Martha's clothes were blood-stained and her jeans and underwear were pulled down to her ankles. Near the teenager was a broken 6-iron golf club, which was used to strike Martha repeatedly in the head. The impact was so forceful, the club was found broken into 3 pieces. The broken golf club pieces were laying all over the ground near her body, everything except the grip of the handle. The law enforcement officers were stunned at the discovery of the body. Greenwich hadn't experienced a violent crime case in the last 30 years, let alone something as heinous as this. The local police were highly unprepared to handle the severity of the given situation. For further thorough investigation, a team from Connecticut County Station was assigned. Forensics at the scene did their best to gather as much evidence as possible, and Martha's body was sent out for autopsy. There was no evidence of sexual assault traced during the autopsy, and the blunt force of her head was found as the initial cause of death. It was later discovered that young Martha Moxley remained a virgin till the end of her life. Whilst the investigation was ongoing, Greenwich local police officers started gathering alibis from every witness they knew to figure out the exact timeline of the homicide. The first person on the list were the Skakel brothers. The police interrogated both the boys on the same day, and they presented their respective alibis for the time of the murder. When questioned, Thomas Skakel told detectives that he last saw Martha around 9:30 p.m. outside his house. He said after he bid goodbye to her, he went straight inside where he joined the family's new live-in tutor, Kenneth Littleton, to watch The French Connection. Thomas soon after went back to his room, later to work on a school report on Abraham Lincoln. His teachers, however, denied they had ever given such an assignment. Thomas was eventually given 2 polygraph tests. The results to the first one remained inconclusive, but Thomas passed the second one. Michael Skakel told detectives that he had left his house around 9:15 p.m. and drove to his cousin Jimmy Turin's house, returning around 11 p.m. The police immediately felt a bit doubtful towards Michael's statement, but didn't have any hard proof to pin him as a suspect to the case. 24-year-old Kenneth Littleton was also investigated in the fall of 1976. He told police he heard noises outside the house sometime between 9:30 and 10 p.m. Before he stepped out, Littleton said he checked up on all the 7 Skakel children, and Michael, along with his older brother Thomas and 2 other Skakel boys, were not at home during that time. According to reports by Detective Solomon, his story was that he heard some noises coming from the bushes on the property, leaves rustling, but he claimed he did not see anything at the time he was out. Littleton further added that he didn't see Thomas until 10:25, when Thomas joined him in front of the TV. The other Skakel boys came home within a half hour. Littleton reportedly had no idea who Martha Moxley was. The night of her murder was actually his first night at the Skakels. Although he failed several lie detector tests, Littleton was never charged with any connection to the case. Amidst the active investigation, police came across 2 startling pieces of evidence. Martha Moxley had been beaten and stabbed with a Tony Pena golf club. These golf clubs were engraved with the initials of N. Skakel, and upon further inspection, the same golf clubs were found at the Skakel household, but one was missing. Their father, Rushton Skakel, who previously was out for a hunting trip, rushed back home upon hearing the news of Martha's murder. Although during the beginning of the investigation, he was quite cooperative with inspections and statements, he soon halted his relations with the police. On January 22, 1976, the Skakels, on the advice of their attorneys, refused to answer any more questions and ended their family's cooperation with investigators. The second thing which raised quite a few questions were the alibis given by Martha's friends. On the evening of October 30, 1975, Martha Moxley left with her friends to participate in mischief night, in which the neighborhood youths would ring bells and pull pranks such as toilet papering houses. According to her friends, Martha was seen flirting with the oldest Skakel brother, Thomas, and was eventually found kissing him moments later. One of her friends later mentioned that they had last seen Martha falling behind the fence with Thomas near the pool in Skakel's backyard at around 9:30 p.m. There were more than 200 scheduled interviews held by detectives within the next several months. All of them were given several polygraph exams to complete the process. Donald Brown, who was the state's attorney for Fairfield County at the time of Martha's murder, said, "No one has an obligation to cooperate with the police, but in most instances, individuals who have some knowledge that may lead to the identification of an individual who has committed a violent crime are more than pleased to contribute that information to the police. So it's most unusual when an individual possessing information decides that he does not want to give that information to investigators." Initially, the case turned cold for almost 2 decades due to lack of information. In 1991, Martha Moxley's case was reopened after a rumor that another Kennedy family member, William Smith Kennedy, may have been involved in the murder. William was on trial for assault charges, and though his connections to the Martha Moxley case were later closed off, this whole ordeal ended up getting the case restarted with new leads. Within the same year, the police brought in the well-known forensic pathologist, Dr. Henry Lee. Dr. Lee was able to utilize technology that was unavailable in 1975. Among the items examined by Dr. Lee were clothes found discarded in the Skakel's garbage shortly after the murder. We found some hairs and fibers. Some of the hair is microscopically similar to hers. Other hair is dissimilar to hers. Dr. Lee determined that the hair belonged to a Caucasian male. The problem was he didn't have any hair sample from any of the possible suspects and was unable to make a match. However, after studying the crime scene photographs, Dr. Lee was able to provide a possible motive for Martha's murder. The blood smear on her body indicates somebody tried to use force. It suggests a sexually motivated homicide. Michael quickly became the prime suspect in the case. Soon after, Rushton Skakel allegedly hired a private investigator to clear his family name. Privately, he hoped information would come out, which would cast suspicion on other suspects, namely former suspect Kenneth Littleton. However, his plan completely backfired. Private investigators Jim Murphy, a former FBI agent, and his assistant Willis Billy Krebs, a former NYPD lieutenant, were both now involved in the Martha Moxley case. When the two men interviewed Tom and Michael Skakel about their activities on the night of Moxley's murder, it turned out both boys had lied to the police. Thomas Skakel had disclosed that it was not 9:30 p.m. when he last saw Martha outside his house, but actually closer to 10 p.m. Also, before Thomas went back inside, he and Martha engaged in some inappropriate activity outside his home. According to Krebs, Thomas began to cry as he admitted this, but his lawyer cut him off before any more could be said. Meanwhile, Michael Skakel told the investigator that he did not go to bed when he arrived home from his cousin's house around 11 p.m. He'd actually climbed a tree outside Martha Moxley's bedroom window and engaged in some inappropriate activity. Author and journalist Dominic Dune got a hold of the investigator's report and passed it on to state inspectors Frank Garr, who had previously been a detective on the case. Though he shared his suspicion about Michael Skakel previously, due to lack of information, it was dismissed. This report would give his theory new momentum. Leonard Levitt, an investigative reporter for the Long Island-based Newsday, covered the Moxley case in 1982. He also shared a similar theory about Michael. He shared that there were no defense wounds, which indicates she knew her attacker. Merely the fact that she was hit repeatedly with a golf club indicates some kind of rage, which personalized this thing, which indicates that there was such anger that the two had to have known each other, that it was a crime of passion. Levitt waited for 20 years to report on Martha Moxley. The report said Thomas and Michael Skakel had made startling admissions to the detectives. Both Thomas and Michael told the investigators that they had lied to the police about their accounts the night of the murder. Thomas said to them that after 9:30, he went inside his house, and then he went back out and spent another 20 minutes with Martha. He claims now that he and Martha engaged in a sexual act, and then he left her at about 10 to 10. If you go back now and you look at the story that he told, it just doesn't add up. In 1998, a one-man grand jury and an investigator were assigned to review the case of Martha Moxley. Upon examining the evidence, Judge George Entham ruled that there was enough to charge Michael Skakel with her murder. Michael was prosecuted with the charges of Martha's murder in his late 30s. It took the court almost 2 long decades to give justice at last. He was convicted after a 3-week trial that relied largely on circumstantial evidence. Investigators had recovered part of the golf club, a 6-iron from a set that had belonged to Michael's mother. But unfortunately, prosecutors had no direct physical evidence to tie Michael with the murder investigation. He claimed he was miles away from the murder scene at a cousin's place where they watched Monty Python's Flying Circus. Even so, jurors later said they were convinced by the incriminating statements he had made as well as his erratic behavior. Several former classmates of Skakel's later testified for the trial. Apparently, when Michael was in Elon School, a specialty school aimed at rehabilitating troubled youth, he had even confessed to them about Martha's murder. One former schoolmate, Gregory Coleman, testified in the pretrial hearing in June 2000 that Skakel told him that "I'm going to get away with murder. I am a Kennedy." Coleman went on to say that he, Michael, had made a comment that he was trying to make advances towards this girl, and that this girl was not complying with those advances, and thus he drove her skull in. However, Coleman did not return to testify in Michael's murder trial in 2002 as he died in August 2001 of a heroin overdose. Michael, in particular, was known to have a troubling past. Though the Skakel secrets were well hidden, rumors of Michael's stay within the walls of Elon School caused quite an uproar. During a group session at his reform school, Michael let out a confession that he was the one who murdered Martha during the night of October 30th. However, the school's owner, Joe Reese, denied any such statements ever being made. Despite this, there were countless witness accounts who confirmed the story. During the Skakel trial, 2 of Michael's former classmates from Elon School came forward as witnesses. One of them was John D. Higgins. Higgins described the ordeal to be a tearful, dazed, and confused confession where Michael said he only remembers fragments of his memories of the crime. Whereas Gregory Coleman, the other witness, said Michael quite brazenly stated that he was sure he would get away with Martha's murder due to his family name. After Michael Skakel was sent off to prison in August 2002, his cousin Robert Kennedy Jr. became a staunchest supporter. He solely believed that his cousin never committed the murder and was entirely getting framed due to political propaganda. "I know Michael Skakel, and I know he didn't commit this crime," Kennedy said in his interview with CBS 48 Hours. In 1997, Michael Skakel made recordings with the ghostwriter Richard Hoffman for his autobiography Dead Man Talking, A Kennedy Cousin Comes Clean. One specific recording played during the trial was particularly damning. Michael said that the night of Martha's murder, he was drunk, had been smoking marijuana, and was having inappropriate urges. When Dorothy Moxley came to his door that morning, Skakel panicked. He said on the recording, "I was still high from the night before, a little drunk." He reported having thought to himself, "Did they see me last night?" Michael claimed he was worried that anyone from the Moxley household might catch him in the act. He said that he engaged in some inappropriate acts while he was on their tree, but prosecutors argued that Michael was actually referring to being seen beating Martha with the golf club. The counterargument from Michael's defense was that there was no physical evidence to convict him and that he had an alibi for the time frame in which Martha was murdered. Nonetheless, the prosecution used the trial to paint Michael as a jealous teen. They claimed Michael was infuriated by being rejected by his crush. While he was under the influence of drugs and alcohol and with access to the murder weapon, he ended up acting on his thoughts. On June 7, 2002, the jury came back with a guilty verdict. Skakel was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. The jury in State Superior Court announced their verdict just after 10:30 a.m., shortly after starting its 4th day of deliberations. Rushton Skakel appeared almost stunned as the foreman pronounced the verdict in the packed silent courtroom. The public rejoiced at the justice given. It was one of the most complicated and tragic cases in the Northeast, surrounded by a swirl of wealth and celebrity. The 27 years of hell finally ended for the Moxley family. Outside the courthouse, Mrs. Moxley faced a huge mass of reporters and television crews. Through tears, Mrs. Moxley said she had prayed before court. "My prayer started out, 'Dear Lord, again today like I have been doing for 27 years. I'm praying that I can find justice for Martha. You know, this whole thing was about Martha.'" She added, "This is Martha's day. This is truly Martha's day." While Michael was in prison, his lawyers and supporters fought for his conviction to be overturned. For appeals were filed, all of which were denied. Then on October 23, 2013, Michael was granted a new trial on the basis that his defense attorney, Mickey Sherman, provided him with constitutionally deficient representation. As a result, Skakel was released on $1,200,000 bail on November 21, 2013. Prosecutors fought their best to get Skakel's conviction reinstated. They succeeded years later in December 2016. Connecticut Supreme Court finally ruled over a 4-3 decision, which said his representation was, in fact, valid. But the case didn't close there. In May 2018, the court reversed its ruling with yet another 4-3 decision, concluding that Michael's representative, Mickey Sherman, failed to provide evidence of Michael's alibi during the original trial. Prosecutors still have the option to retry Michael, but will certainly have difficulty doing so due to deceased witnesses and other problems. Michael's legal team in an issued statement praised the court's decision, saying that it had done the right thing. The lawyers also said that Michael, who maintains that he is innocent, has been unjustly imprisoned. The Moxleys, however, remain certain of Michael's guilt. "There's no doubt in my mind that he did it," Dorothy said. John Moxley, her 59-year-old son, said that the jury's verdict in the 2002 trial, which they reached after hearing the evidence against Michael Skakel, continued to give him reassurance. "There's a comfort level on our part that we know what happened," he said. Michael Skakel is now 55 and lives with his aunt in Westchester County, New York. He spends his day taking care of his 15-year-old son, George, and doing his best to move on from the trauma of his past conviction and imprisonment. He's legally bound to ask for court's permission to travel outside Connecticut or New York. I'd like to put this nightmare behind me so I can begin to have some semblance of a life with George without all of this hanging over my head. He said in the email, I lost 11 and a half years of my life. I miss George's childhood altogether. I know I will never get those years back, but I feel lucky to spend time with George now. The death of Martha Moxley was a recurring nightmare for the Greenwich community and her family and friends, which lasted over 40 long years. While many still believe in favor of the court's justice that the verdict against Michael was fabricated, but in the end, a mother lost her daughter and the state of Connecticut failed to get proper justice for Martha's death. Many believe Michael walked away as a free man due to his connections and wealth. Martha's father, John David Moxley, died in 1988 fighting for his daughter's justice. The Kennedy family continues to gain fame from the Martha Moxley case even now. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who wrote a book entitled Frame, Why Michael Skakel Spent Over a Decade in Prison for a Murder He Didn't Commit in 2016. Dorothy Moxley, Martha's 84-year-old mother, said the book had left her at a loss for words. She added that truth never looked so twisted and manipulated in her entire life. She still believed that Michael was the murderer of her child. Kennedy's book devoted an entire chapter to skewing the character of John, Martha's dad. He questioned his whereabouts on the night of the murder and raised numerous allegations on the Moxley family. Michael Skakel remains free as of December 2019. The name of Martha Moxley is etched into the hearts of Greenwich forever. A young, beautiful girl was stripped of her childhood before she could even bloom out of her teenage years. This isn't the first tragedy that has been buried by the Kennedy men. The trial between Michael and the Moxley family was a war waged by the entire United States. And while there is still much speculation on this case, we give our deepest condolences to the family of the deceased. Family mattered greatly to Byron Carr. He and his brother John were close in age, which fostered a strong bond, and he maintained a close relationship with his parents, especially his mother, throughout adulthood. He also had many friends and loved to travel. Aaron was a beloved English teacher at Montague Regional High School. Some former students noted that he had a heart of gold and continued to care about their lives long after they finished his class. In 1988, 36-year-old Byron was living in a house on Lapthorne Avenue in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, which he took great pride in and kept very neat. It would be in this house where Byron was killed on November 11, 1988. He was strangled with a towel, and his body had later been stabbed several times. The killer had written "I will kill again" on Byron's wall, which obviously raised concerns that more victims would follow. Byron's wallet was also missing. There were no signs of forced entry into the house, and police believe Byron and the killer had consensual sex prior to his murder. Byron was gay but kept his sexuality private to avoid the discrimination so many others dealt with at the time. He had not even come out to his parents, despite how close they were. His murder led to him being publicly outed. Decades later, investigators would say that Byron's sexuality led to a lack of public interest and cooperation in the case. Byron's family felt this was the case as well. In 2024, Byron's brother John would say, people were afraid for their jobs just because they were gay at the time. Being gay wasn't a great thing back in 1988 in the public eye. I can remember public officials that were very lukewarm to taking part in the investigation. Other members of the LGBTQ community in the area feared that they may be targeted by the killer as well, and the wider community's cold response to the murder of a gay man only added to their fears that they were not safe on Prince Edward Island. Jeffrey Haight is one of Byron's former students and a gay man who left Prince Edward Island for many years because he felt safer living in a big city. In 2024, he spoke to the CBC about Byron and his murder, saying, "Why was this situation created? Well, it was because society didn't let us be us and we had to live in the shadows. And when you live in the shadows, you meet certain people you should not be around." Police believed the killer was bisexual, a conclusion they came to following the examination of the most important piece of evidence they had, the killer's underwear, which had been left behind at the scene. Police cut out a section from the front of the underwear to test it for DNA and found both male and female DNA, believed to be from the owner of the underwear and a woman he had sex with. The size of the underwear indicated that the killer had a small build, as it fit very tightly when displayed on a mannequin with a 29.5 inches waist. Despite the societal unease around Byron's sexuality and murder, police did preserve evidence and investigate the crime. Hundreds of interviews were conducted over the ensuing decades. Police went to see Byron's parents every few years about the investigation, even though they rarely had substantial progress to report. Byron's case was formally reopened in October of 2007. Investigators hoped that since the LGBTQ community was becoming more accepted, witnesses who may have been scared to come forward in 1988 because it would involve disclosing their own sexuality would now be willing to speak with them. The Charlottetown Police Service also released a composite image of a suspect who attacked a gay man in Charlottetown just 2 months after Byron was killed and was considered a person of interest in the murder. The case would remain unsolved until 2024. That January 26th, Chief Brad McConnell announced that the day before, 56-year-old Todd Joseph Gallant, also known as Todd Joseph Irving, had been arrested and charged with 1 count of first-degree murder and 1 count of interfering with human remains in connection with Byron's murder. A second person had also been arrested but then released, although their potential involvement in the case is still being investigated. Police had long believed that at least one other man had come back with the killer to try to remove incriminating evidence from Byron's house after he was killed. In 2013, they revealed that 2 unconnected witnesses had come forward saying that a man had confessed to them that the killer had taken him back to Byron's house after the murder to get rid of evidence. The 2 witnesses came forward in 2008 and 2012 and new details that had not been made public. The individual they reported, whose name has not been released, had been released on parole shortly before Byron was killed, had a violent criminal history, and had been a potential suspect in the murder early on in the investigation. However, he had passed away in the early 2000s and, as such, could not be interviewed about who brought him to Byron's house that night. Police believed that it was when the killer brought his accomplice to the scene hours after Byron was strangled with the towel, that Byron was stabbed, the note was written on the wall, and Byron's wallet was stolen. These actions were taken to confuse police. Socks had been found in Byron's kitchen trash can. Police believed that someone had worn them on their hands in the house so that they would not leave behind any fingerprints. DNA was extracted from the inside of one of the socks, but it did not match the DNA on the underwear where the deceased reported accomplice. As such, a third individual may have been involved in the attempted cleanup and tampering with the crime scene after the murder occurred. Gallant had only been 21 years old at the time of Byron's murder. He had been living in Charlottetown in 1988 but moved to the United States after Byron was killed. He lived in Texas and Arkansas before moving back to Prince Edward Island in 2022. He was convicted of breaking and entering in Canada in 1987 and had a criminal record in the United States as well. He had been identified using genetic genealogy. Charlottetown police worked with Wyndham Forensics Group and Convergence Investigative Genetic Genealogy to identify him as the contributor of the DNA at the crime scene after familial matches to it were found in the family tree DNA and GED match databases. Gallant's lawyer, Chris Montigny, appeared in court on Gallant's behalf on February 1st. The case was adjourned until the following month to give Montigny time to review the large amount of evidence and documents in the case. He does not yet know how his client will plead to the charges he is facing. On the day Byron was buried, his mother turned to her son John and told him, "It's not really over until we know what happened and why." It was never over for her or for Byron's father, as they both passed away a few years before charges were brought in their son's case. Byron's brother John was still alive to see Gallant's arrest and was present at the press conference announcing it. He thanked police for all of their hard work and said of the arrest finally being made, "It's like a weight being lifted off you. It's hard to describe. It's just kind of a release." Carol Barrett was one of 6 children raised on McIntyre Street in Zanesville, Ohio. She had a cheerful and spirited personality. Independent in her thinking, she was never shy about expressing her opinions. A bit of a tomboy, she often wrestled with her 3 brothers on the living room floor. During high school, she participated in the concert band, the marching band, and was part of the school radio station staff. Carol was very brave. In the summer of 1978, she jumped into the water to save her 2-year-old niece from drowning. That same year, Carol and her family went on vacation to Florida. Carol loved her time there and heard a lot about how much fun spring break was in the area. She begged her parents to let her go back to Florida for spring break the following spring when she would be a senior in high school, but they did not allow it. Carol graduated in 1979 and went to work at a Wendy's restaurant with the goal of saving enough money to go to Florida the following spring. Not all of her money went to her trip savings, however. She used some of it to buy sheets and glassware and towels when she had the chance. She put the various home goods she was able to acquire in her hope chest, saving them for when she married her high school sweetheart, Tom, who had joined the Navy. When Carol wanted to go to Florida with her friends from high school in the spring of 1980, her parents finally allowed her to go. Carol began the drive to Daytona Beach shores on March 20th with her large group of friends split between 2 vehicles. They drove throughout the night, taking turns driving. When they arrived in Daytona Beach shores, they checked into their rooms at the Treasure Island Motel. The girls were staying in room 617, and the boys were a floor below them in room 521. The group was hanging out in the girls' room that Saturday night. Shortly after 1 a.m. on Sunday morning, March 23rd, Carol and her friend Steve left the room to go walk around. On their way to the elevator, a man blocked their path. He pointed a pistol at them and told them that they were going to turn around and go back to their room. Steve told him that they did not have a key, but the man pointed the gun at Steve's face, and the 3 of them walked back to room 617. They knocked on the door and were led inside. The assailant followed Steve and Carol into the room and told all 8 people there at the time that he wanted their money. He made everyone undress and line up against the sliding glass door to the balcony. He spent about 45 minutes going through everyone's belongings and eventually pocketed approximately $200 throughout that time. He periodically clicked his gun, according to one of Carol's friends. He seemed nervous over the fact that there was such a large group of people in the room. He touched them all with the barrel of his pistol to intimidate them. The assailant told the group that he would be taking one of them with him to ensure that no one called the police. He originally grabbed Carol's friend, Pam, but grew frustrated when she panicked and began to sob. Carol volunteered to go in her place. She calmly did as he told her and collected her clothes. He forced the others in the room out onto the balcony and told them to stay there until 4 a.m. He would let Carol go if they did not call the police. He locked the sliding glass door and forced Carol out of the hotel room in front of him. Carol's friends did not listen to the instructions and quickly tried to get her help. Carol's friend, Chris, was able to climb around the block wall separating their balcony from the neighboring one and wake up the people sleeping inside that room. They called the police, but the assailant had a 20-minute head start before they arrived. On Monday morning, a passerby discovered Carol's body in a ditch line along I-95 near Jacksonville International Airport. Her white sweater had been pulled up over her head. She had been shot execution style, according to police. There were no other marks indicating that there had been any kind of struggle. 2 of Carol's friends identified her body, which was returned to Ohio and buried in the Mount Olive. Carol's friends helped develop a sketch of what the killer looked like. He had reddish-brown hair, which was parted down the middle, a beard and mustache, a mole on his left cheek, and a long straight nose. He wore tinted wire rim glasses. Unfortunately, despite the numerous eyewitnesses to Carol's abduction, her killer was not identified and the case went cold. In August of 2017, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit reviewed the evidence in Carol's case and determined that there was enough to reopen the case. A palm print they had not been able to account for had been preserved in evidence and seemed like a clue that could tie a suspect to the murder. The case would not be closed until January of 2024. On January 25th, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office announced that the investigation had come to an end after more than 40 years. As with many other cold cases solved after decades, the identification of Carol's killer would not result in a trial. However, while most of these cases never go to court because a suspect died before their identification, in Carol's case, the man who confessed to her murder was still alive but already serving life in prison. That man was serial killer Billy Mansfield Jr. Mansfield had an extensive history of sexual crimes. His crimes eventually progressed to murder, with him killing 3 young women and 2 teenage girls. He killed 4 of his victims in Florida and buried their bodies in his backyard. He then went to California, where he killed a 5th woman. He pled guilty to the California murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He also pled guilty to the 4 murders he committed in Florida to avoid being extradited there and facing the death penalty. He remains incarcerated in California and is speaking with investigators in various jurisdictions about additional cold cases. Mansfield was identified as a potential suspect in Carol's murder in 2020. He was interviewed by investigators multiple times over the following 2 years. In September of 2022, he acknowledged that he was the man depicted in the composite sketch. He later confessed to abducting Carol and to killing her. Investigators continued working on the case and consulted with the state attorney's office in the 4th Judicial Circuit about how to proceed. In January of 2024, it was decided to close Carol's case but not pursue prosecuting Mansfield for her murder, since he is incarcerated and has no chance of ever being released, as he would have to serve 4 concurrent life sentences in Florida even if he were somehow released from his life sentence in California. Carol's parents, 1 of her sisters, and 2 of her brothers passed away before her case was closed. Her surviving family is grateful for the answers they have received. Carol's niece, Claire Gilligan, is ecstatic that the case is solved and relieved that her aunt's killer has been incarcerated since 1982, which prevented him from killing. Burt Allen Mann loved history from an early age, with a particular focus on the history of the American Civil War. He also loved classical music and opera. He grew up in Graham, Texas, and attended the University of Texas in Austin, where he earned a Bachelor of Science degree in zoology. He also served with the U.S. Marines as a Navy corpsman in Vietnam. In 1994, 46-year-old Burt and his wife Dawn lived in the 2,500 block of Stargrass Circle in South Austin, Texas. On May 12th that year, Dawn came home to discover her husband's body lying on their floor. It appeared that a burglar had forced his way into their home through a back door, and Burt had arrived home from work while he was still inside. A struggle began near the front door, and Burt was ultimately stabbed several times. Police found the crime unusual because individuals who commit property crimes like burglary typically flee when discovered rather than attack. The break-in and murder also occurred in the middle of the afternoon, when children would be coming home from school and adults would be arriving home from work. More than 20 detectives worked on the case over the ensuing years. Following the establishment of the Austin Police Department's Cold Case Unit in 2005, a bloodstain that had been preserved from the crime scene was sent to the lab to test for DNA. The killer had apparently been injured as Burt tried to fight him off, and his blood had been left inside the house after he fled. A DNA profile was successfully developed from the bloodstain, but no match to it was found in the combined DNA index system. In March of 2023, the unknown profile was sent to Bode Technology in hopes that they could use genetic genealogy to identify a suspect. In June of that year, they did just that. The man they believed could have been Burt's killer had never been a suspect in the case. The potential suspect was a man named Kenneth Wayne Robbins, who was living in Lubbock, Texas, and working as a long-haul truck driver. Investigators made attempts to surreptitiously collect items thrown away by Robbins to test them for DNA, but they were unsuccessful. Therefore, on September 8, 2023, detectives from Austin traveled to Lubbock with a search warrant to collect a DNA sample from Robbins. They served him with it at his work and collected the sample. He refused to speak with them. 5 days later, the Austin Police Department was contacted by Robbins' employer, who was obviously aware that the department had an interest in him. They reported that the GPS tracker in their truck that Robbins was driving at the time showed that it had been parked at a truck stop in Weatherford, Texas, and had not moved in what they considered to be a suspiciously long amount of time. Police in Austin contacted their counterparts in Weatherford and asked them to perform a welfare check. When they arrived at the truck, they found Robbins dead inside of it. His autopsy would find that he had committed suicide. On February 8, 2024, the Austin Police Department announced that they had identified Robbins as the sole person responsible for Burt's murder. The DNA sample taken from him was a match to the DNA from the crime scene, and had he not taken his own life, he would have been charged with capital murder. Not everyone in Bert's family lived to see his alleged killer identified. His father passed away in 2019, and his mother, Virginia, died just a year before the case was closed. Bert's widow and younger sister did finally learn who took Bert from them. We don't have that big question hanging over our hearts. I had really kind of given up hope that it would happen, and I'm so grateful, his sister, Kathy May, told KVUE News. She is relieved that she does not have to go through the stress of a trial, but is upset over what Robbins' family members must be going through in light of the news of his crime and his death. Everett Delano enlisted in the Navy in 1941, with most of his service during World War II occurring in the Pacific Theater. He received training in radio and radio operations and was stationed at various bases across the United States after the war ended. He married his wife, Blanche, in 1951, and they had a son and 2 daughters. During Everett's post-war service, he was often away for months at a time on assignments to ships in the Mediterranean, and his family frequently relocated as he was transferred from base to base. By 1964, Everett and Blanche sought more stability in their lives, leading Everett to decide to retire from the Navy. Everett's extended family mostly lived in and around Orange, Massachusetts, and Blanche's family was in New Hampshire. The Delanos decided to move to Wilmot Flat, New Hampshire, to be close to Blanche's family. Everett's transition to civilian life did not go quite as he had hoped. He had a lot of specialized skills thanks to his years in the Navy, and he thought that perhaps he would be able to find a job repairing radios or even television sets. He could not find such a job in his relatively small town. Since he had left the service to spend more time with his family, he did not want to commute over an hour each way to the nearest larger towns where there may have been more opportunities for him. While he weighed his options for his civilian career, Everett took a job working security overnight at Colby Sawyer College in New London, New Hampshire, and picked up shifts as he could at Sanborn's Garage, a mechanic shop and gas station in Andover, New Hampshire, where he worked in the office and as an attendant, filling customers' cars with gas and accepting their payments. Everett was at Sanborn's Garage on September 1, 1966. The shop's owner, Kenneth Sanborn, left Everett alone there that day because he had errands to run. Kenneth left at 8:50 that morning, and the register would show that Everett processed 3 payments between that time and 9:25 a.m. At that time, a local woman who knew Everett saw him at the shop and waved to him as she drove by. Everett smiled and waved back to her. A white car pulled up to get gas a short time later, but no attendant came out to fill the tank, so the driver pulled out of the station at 9:45. She shrugged to 2 men who were arriving at the station at that time, indicating she was confused as to why no employees were there. The 2 men looked into the office. They saw a man lying on the floor and heard a sound they thought was snoring, so they believed he had passed out on the floor drunk. 3 more men arrived at 10 o'clock. When one of them looked inside the office, they saw that blood had begun to pool under the man on the floor's head. One of the men went to the Sanborn home, while the others called the state police and the nearest hospital. Whenever it was taken to New London Hospital, it was at first believed that he had been badly beaten. However, it was soon realized that he had instead been shot 3 times in the head. His autopsy would find that he had been standing when he was shot the first 2 times, but the 3rd shot had been fired at very close range once he had fallen to the floor. Everett was stabilized, but he remained in critical condition. He was transferred to a larger hospital but died there of his injuries the following day. He was 49 years old. It appeared that Everett had been killed during a robbery. The money in the cash register, approximately $100, was missing. Everett's killer had not noticed a cash box containing around $500 that was hidden nearby. The water in the sink in the men's restroom had been left running. When Kenneth Sanborn's wife arrived at the station, she luckily realized that whoever shot Everett may have been the person who last turned on the faucet. She therefore went outside to turn off the water to the building at the water pump, leaving the faucet handles undisturbed. A crime scene technician from the state police was able to pull a usable fingerprint from the chrome surface. Everett had been killed with a .22 caliber handgun. State police officers therefore looked into anyone who had registered such a firearm in the area and checked on recent sales of handguns of that caliber. Numerous firearms were collected from members of the community and subjected to ballistics testing, but none of the bullets fired during these tests were a match to the bullets from the crime scene. A nearby river was searched in case the killer had thrown the murder weapon into it, but nothing was found. 6 days after the murder, the clue that would eventually solve the case, the fingerprint lifted from the faucet at the crime scene, was submitted to the FBI to be included in their national database. However, it will be more than 50 years before the case will be closed. The New Hampshire State Police formed a cold case unit in 2009, but Everett's case was not included when they compiled a list of all the unsolved homicides in the state. In 2013, Everett's daughter, Darlene, was able to get in contact with the unit and ask why her father's case was not being investigated. When the evidence in the case was finally examined, a suspect was identified almost immediately. When the fingerprint from the crime scene had been submitted to the FBI in 1966, fingerprints had to be compared manually. By 2013, the Bureau had long since moved over to using a digital database known as AFIS. The New Hampshire State Police Forensic Laboratory had begun using AFIS in 1998, but did not run any prints from cases from before that year unless an agency specifically requested it. When the fingerprint from Everett's case was finally run through AFIS, a match was found. It belonged to a man named Thomas Cass, who'd been 20 years old in 1966. Cass had an extensive criminal record. The first of his 13 convictions was in 1966 for larceny, and the last was for manufacturing drugs inside of a federal prison in 2000. The crimes in between ranged from marijuana possession to assault to robbery. He grew up in an abusive home and recreated that environment in his own home once he grew up and got married multiple times. He has been described by multiple people who knew him as a violent person, and he was known to brag about his criminal activities. He had moved to Springfield, Massachusetts in 1966 with his wife and lived there until he went to prison for robbing a gas station in 1967. Investigators met with Cass in October of 2013. They discussed Everett Delano's murder but did not inform him that his fingerprint had tied him to the crime. Cass claimed to have no knowledge of the crime or even where the town of Andover was. He claimed to have only been to New Hampshire once when he visited Hampton. However, he also acknowledged during that same meeting that in 1971, he had stolen a car in Vermont and driven it into New Hampshire. He had been convicted of 2 counts of robbery in Grafton County, New Hampshire Superior Court in 1972 in connection to this incident. At another meeting in November of 2013, Cass willingly provided a sample of his DNA but did not agree to take a polygraph examination. On February 20, 2014, investigators arrived at Cass's home in Orleans, Vermont unannounced. It was during this interaction that they informed him that forensic evidence had tied him to the 1966 murder of Everett Delano. Cass continued to deny having ever been to Andover, New Hampshire, or Sanborn's garage. The investigators then executed a search warrant for the property in hopes of finding the murder weapon, but no weapons were found inside the home. 4 days later, the cold case unit was notified by the Vermont State Police that they had been sent to Cass's residence following a 911 call made by Cass's live-in girlfriend. He had committed suicide, shooting himself in the head with a .45 caliber handgun. According to his girlfriend, he had not acted out of character after his last meeting with investigators, but she did see him with a large amount of cash, which he may have used to purchase the gun. He never made any admissions to her about his involvement in the murder. During later meetings with investigators, she said that Cass had believed he was going to be arrested for a cold case on the day that he killed himself. He had also told her that he would not talk about something that did not have a statute of limitations and that he did not want to go back to prison. While Everett's family was then notified about the fingerprint match and the suicide, the case would remain formally open for another 5 years. It was not until February 20, 2019 that the Attorney General's office released a report identifying Cass as Everett's killer and formally declaring the case solved and closed. According to Assistant Attorney General Susan Morrill, the case had not been closed in 2014 because of the extensive verification process needed to confirm Cass's involvement and the Colgate unit's lack of resources to undertake it. The Delano family then released a statement reading, "Our family would like to take the opportunity to not only thank the initial investigators of our father's homicide, but also the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit. Without their diligent efforts, we would not be here today. We are happy this day has come where our family has been given a small measure of justice. For almost 53 years, our family has wondered what happened on September 1st, 1966. There was a very long time our family didn't know if we would ever receive the answers about what happened that day. Today, our family has the long overdue answers we have been waiting for. 2011 was a great year for Kevin Drinks, a 50-year-old father and grandfather from Philadelphia. He and his wife Kenya had just bought their dream home, a twin house with hardwood floors in the Ronhurst neighborhood. Kevin and Kenya were high school sweethearts, meeting in 1978 when they were 16 and 15, respectively. Kevin took Kenya to her senior prom at Germantown High School, but they broke up shortly after her graduation. Kevin later got married, had 3 daughters, and experienced a divorce. When he heard Kenya's mother passed away in 2000, he went to pay his respects and reconnected with Kenya. The couple married the following year. Kevin came from a long line of vocalists and sang gospel songs at his church. He sang Lionel Richie's song Lady as Kenya walked down the aisle at their wedding, inserting her name into the lyrics. Kevin had also gotten a new job. December 10, 2011 was his 4th day working as a delivery driver for Underground Market Furniture. Just before 6:30 that evening, he was sitting in his delivery vehicle parked in North Philadelphia. Someone fired multiple shots into the vehicle, with 3 of them striking Kevin. He was rushed to Hahnemann Hospital but died shortly after he arrived. Kevin's family could not imagine anyone having a motive to kill Kevin. He was a faithful member of his church and loved his family, especially his 5 grandchildren. He had no enemies. His loved ones were upset by whispers that he must have been involved in unsavory or illegal activities for someone to kill him so violently. Kevin's widow Kenya took a very active role in advocating for her husband's case. She almost immediately created buttons that read justice for Kevin and distributed them to her family members. She spent a lot of time in the neighborhood where the murder occurred, passing out flyers and hoping to find witnesses. She organized a vigil and created a reward fund a month after her husband was killed. She spoke to the media about the case even as it grew colder. Kenya sold the home she and Kevin had just bought, no longer feeling safe there. She continued contacting police about her husband's case over the years and grew frustrated as they continued to tell her that they had no new information. Kevin's family continued to wear the justice for Kevin buttons Kenya had made for more than a decade. Finally, on April 4, 2022, Kenya spoke at a press conference. She instructed the family members who surrounded her to finally take off the buttons because justice for Kevin had finally been served. That day, for men, Chad Reynolds, Michael Blackston, Samaj Armstead, and Rayshawn Combs had been convicted of various murder and conspiracy charges in connection to Kevin's murder. A jury in Philadelphia found Reynolds, Blackston, and Armstead guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and several related charges. Combs had been found guilty of third-degree murder and conspiracy. Reynolds, Blackston, and Armstead were sentenced to life in prison, while Combs received 2 consecutive 15 to 40-year sentences. Kevin had been killed in a case of mistaken identity. When his family was shown a picture of the man the killers had actually been targeting, they were shocked to see how closely he physically resembled Kevin. The conspiracy that ultimately culminated in Kevin's murder had initially been discovered in 2017 when Philadelphia Police Detective John Verrecchio listened to recorded jailhouse phone calls from late 2011. Ronalds had made one of these phone calls. He was incarcerated at the time because he had been accused of committing a murder 2 months before Kevin was killed. The phone conversation was done in code, but Detective Verrecchio was able to tell that Reynolds and his associates were trying to orchestrate the murder of the key witness against Reynolds. Based on their description of the witness, the area where he worked, and his vehicle, investigators realized that when the men working with Reynolds had gone out looking for their target, they had misidentified Kevin as the witness in the other case. The attorney's office was able to obtain cell phone data that showed that the killers had followed Kevin around the city for the entire day before he was killed. They also located a cooperating witness to further build a case against all 4 men. They were all arrested for Kevin's murder in 2018. Blackston is also suspected to be involved in at least 5 murders. Following the convictions, Kenya Drinks urged other families with loved ones whose cases had gone cold to continue advocating for them because their cases could be solved. As for the men convicted of killing her husband, she said, "We know what the Bible says. We know we have to forgive them, but we're working on it. We're working on it and we'll never forget it." Carla Lowe was kind, generous, and dedicated to her family. She took care of her nieces and nephews while her sister was at work. She was very maternal towards them, putting on magic shows to entertain them, but also making them stand holding volumes of the encyclopedia as punishment for when they misbehaved. On the morning of November 13, 1983, Carla's body was discovered in the 1700 block of Depot Avenue in Delray Beach, Florida. Police believe she had been killed while waiting for an Amtrak train at the nearby station. Her younger sister, Jackie, was supposed to take the train with her, but had changed her mind at the last minute. Carla had been severely beaten and then run over with a truck. Her injuries were so severe that her family was unable to have her casket open at her funeral. It would be 38 years before an arrest was finally made in Carla's case. New technology from British forensic science company Foster and Freeman allowed police to extract and identify a fingerprint on a butter knife found with Carla's body. A match to that fingerprint was on file with police. In November of 2021, a grand jury found that there was sufficient evidence to charge the person whose fingerprint was found at the scene with murder. On November 29, 2021, 59-year-old Ralph Williams was arrested and charged with first-degree murder with a weapon in connection with Carla's murder. His arrest was the first made by the Delray Police Department's cold case unit following its formation in January of that year. Williams had been born just one day after Carla in December of 1961. He had been a suspect in her case from the very beginning. The day Carla's body was discovered, Williams had been arrested for unrelated grand theft auto and burglary charges. Other individuals in police custody with him told authorities that he had confessed to Carla's murder to them. When police searched his apartment, they did find a chunk of bloody, reddish hair. They appear to have not viewed this as conclusive evidence, and they did not charge him with Carla's murder at the time. Carla's murder had been reopened in 2005 with the hope that DNA could be found on the evidence from her case. But the effort had been unsuccessful and the case was closed again. It was opened by the new cold case unit in February of 2021 when the new technology allowed for the fingerprint to be identified and for charges to be filed. While Carla's killer was finally identified and arrested, it is hard to say that Carla and her family got justice in light of how the criminal case against Williams concluded. Williams and his lawyer negotiated a plea deal, and Carla's family came to the courthouse with some of them traveling from out of state to hear him plead guilty and receive his reduced sentence. However, once he got in front of the judge, Williams rejected the plea deal and claimed that he had not received adequate legal counsel from his public defender. He said he planned to pay for a new attorney on his own. Carla's younger sister, Jackie, said later that she was so angry at seeing the smug look on his face that she thought she was going to pass out in the courtroom. The following day, Williams changed his mind and accepted the plea deal. Instead of first-degree murder, he pled to manslaughter. He was sentenced to 365 days in jail and 10 years of probation. He was given credit for time served since his arrest and left court as a free man that same day. Carla's family is trying to move on, but they do so with a lot of anger over her killer receiving only a slap on the wrist for her murder. In a perfect world, I would have liked him to be brought to trial in 1983 and put to death for what he did to her. But no, he lived 39 years while she didn't. Carla's sister, Jackie, told the South Florida Sun-Sentinel. In 1999, cosmetology student Susan Cox met Joshua Powell at a dinner party in Tacoma, Washington. Both were devoted followers of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the chemistry between them was unmistakable. Friends close to the couple noted that just days after they met, Joshua had proposed, and they had begun making plans for their future together. Susan was completely enchanted by Josh, and in 2001, the couple wed in a traditional LDS ceremony. Following their marriage, the two moved in with Josh's father, Stephen Powell, in South Hill, Puyallup, Utah. Stephen welcomed his daughter-in-law with open arms, but his behavior soon took a turn for the worse. Susan had gotten a job as a broker at Wells Fargo, and to the outside world all seemed well. Josh and Susan were thriving, but behind closed doors evil was lurking. Stephen had taken a particular liking to Susan. In the 3 years the couple lived with him, his behavior escalated to stealing her underwear to filming her without her consent. Susan was disgusted by Stephen's behavior and attitude towards her, and things came to a head when she discovered he'd been writing love songs dedicated to her. He would later tell the Today Show, "I wasn't going to turn down an opportunity with this beautiful woman, even though she's my son's wife." One of the songs, titled Waiting for You, included lyrics such as, "I could be getting a mistaken impression. Each time you seem to gaze at me, you let me touch you softly. Why is the question, and the effect amazes me." In 2004, the Powells were relieved when they moved to West Valley City and finally got away from Stephen. Little did Susan know that Stephen's bizarre behavior was just the tip of the iceberg. She had jumped out of the frying pan into the fire being Josh's controlling and abusive behavior. Now that the two were alone, Josh exerted complete control over his wife, making her life miserable. He began to withdraw from the LDS church, something that Susan was passionate about, and he remained in close contact with his father, Stephen, despite his inappropriate behavior towards Susan. By 2007, Susan and Josh had welcomed 2 sons, Charles, born 2005, and Braden, born 2007. Susan dove headfirst into motherhood and was known to be a loving and devoted mother. She juggled her job as a broker with her job as a parent, whilst Josh was in between jobs. It was apparent to those outside the marriage that cracks were beginning to show. Susan was the primary breadwinner and Josh was living a lifestyle well beyond their means. Josh's spending habits and withdrawal from the LDS church began to grate on Susan, and the pair became distant. Susan recorded a disturbing video in which she said, "This is me July 29, 2008, covering all my bases, making sure that if anything happens to me or my family or all of us that our assets are documented." She banned the camera around the home, but it was clear that Susan's message had a double meaning. KOMO News reported that in June 2008, Susan had written a new will in secret. The will in part read, quote, "I want it to be documented somewhere that there is extreme turmoil in our marriage. Josh threatened that if we get a divorce, there will be no lawyers, only a church mediator, and I will ruin you." She also stated that Josh had told her, quote, "You, Susan, will be destroyed and your life would be over and the boys will not grow up with a mom and dad." Final paragraph chillingly read, quote, "If I die, it was not an accident, even if it looks like one." Just over a year later, Susan Powell disappeared under mysterious circumstances. December 6, 2009 started like any other day for the Powells. Susan took her children to a church service before returning home. News outlet The Deserter provided an in-depth timeline of Susan's last known movements. The last person to see Susan was a neighbor who saw her around 5 p.m. Susan had made dinner for the family before taking a nap as she felt unwell. After this, what happened to Susan remains a complete mystery. The next day, on December 7, 2009, the West Valley City Police Department received a call from a babysitter of Charles and Braden. The pair failed to attend daycare that morning, and Josh and Susan were both unreachable. Their families had also tried to contact them to no avail. The West Valley City Police Department quickly began the search for the Powell family, fearing that the worst may have occurred. Hours later, at 5 p.m., Joshua and the boys returned to the West Valley family home without Susan. Josh's behavior was noted as very strange and erratic, and when officers entered the house earlier that day, they found that 2 fans had been blowing on a wet spot on the carpet. Susan's purse, wallet, and ID, bank cards were found inside the home, but her cell phone was missing. Upon his return, Josh told the investigators a bizarre story of how he had whisked his kids away on a late-night camping trip to Simpson Springs in Utah. He claimed that Susan had been asleep when he left because she felt unwell. Investigators found that hard to believe that Josh had taken 2 small children into the woods in the freezing December weather. Data indicated that on December 7th, Utah experienced highs of 7 degrees Celsius or 44 Fahrenheit and lows of -17 Celsius and 1 degree Fahrenheit with blizzard-like condition. Investigators ordered a further examination of the Powell home, and at this time they found 2 crucial clues. Firstly was Susan's phone, which was found in the car Joshua had used on December 7th to take his kids camping. When questioned, Charles and Braden agreed that they'd been camping, but only after encouragement from their father. Second, forensic investigators found a blood stain on the carpet, and a DNA test proved that it belonged to Susan. There was still insufficient evidence for investigators to press charges, and the search continued. They also found life insurance policies for Susan worth over $1 million and Susan's privately stashed will, letter, and video. Josh tried to return to normal following Susan's disappearance, despite the circumstances and the media circus that followed. News outlets quickly discovered Stephen's bizarre obsession with his daughter-in-law, Susan, and soon the blame began to fall on Josh. Charles and Braden gave chilling accounts of what happened that cold December evening once they were away from the influence of their father. Charles told a teacher that Susan had been with them on their camping trip, but that she hadn't been alive. Braden also drew a picture of the van, similar to the Chrysler minivan the Powells owned, with the picture depicting his mother sleeping in the trunk of the car. Things would take a sickening turn in 2011 when the full scope of Stephen's obsession was revealed after he was arrested for voyeurism, inappropriate child materials. It was also around this time that Josh lost custody of his two sons, and they were placed in the care of their maternal grandparents. Investigators slowly began piecing together the puzzle and getting closer to arresting Josh. It became evident to investigators that Josh was a narcissist who emotionally abused his wife and controlled her life, but the unthinkable would happen before action could be taken. February 5, 2012 is a date that Susan's parents will never forget. That afternoon, Elizabeth Griffin Hall arrived at Josh's home with Charles and Braden for a supervised visit. Psychologist Dr. James Manley, who had undertaken Josh's psychological evaluation, noted that he suffered with adjustment disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. Before Elizabeth could enter the door, Josh slammed it in her face. She heard the locks clicking from inside and immediately began to bang on the door. She told Josh to let her inside and desperately called 911 to get some backup. Elizabeth stood on the side of the road outside of the home, waiting for the police to arrive to retrieve the children. Just minutes later, the Powell home exploded and erupted in flames. Charles Joshua Powell was 7 years old. Braden Timothy Powell was just 5 years old. Emergency responders arrived, but it was too late. Investigators found that Josh had taken an axe to his sons before dousing them in gasoline and setting the home on fire. He had sent an email to his lawyer stating that he was sorry, and he also sent goodbye messages to his family. Investigators were heartbroken by the conclusion of this bizarre situation. In 2013, Michael Powell, Josh's brother, who was also believed to have some involvement, also took his own life. Almost all possible suspects and witnesses in Susan's disappearance are now gone. Stephen didn't provide the police with any valuable information, and following his release in 2017, he too would pass away due to natural causes. This investigation had led the police on a wild goose chase, and despite $1,000 in cutting-edge techniques, the West Valley City Police Department were no closer to solving this case than they were in 2009. Investigators believe Susan's body may be buried somewhere in Simpson Springs or the surrounding Utah wilderness. With all potential witnesses and suspects now deceased, investigators are holding out for new information or evidence to surface. Susan's disappearance encompasses so many bizarre tales and stories. It's hard to discern what is the truth and what is a red herring. Susan Marie Powell is described as a white female with brown highlighted hair, blue eyes, 5'4", and 130 pounds. She was last seen wearing a long-sleeve black shirt and black dress pants. Anyone with information is asked to contact Detective David Greco of the West Valley City Police Department. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.